One of the key features of Trump's foreign policy agenda is the doubling down of US aggression against China, which obviously takes a military form, but it also seeing the rapid escalation of the new Cold War with these new tariffs. So I just wanted to quote the Chinese embassy from the United States made the headlines recently, tweeting, "If war is what the US wants, be it a tariff war, a trade war, or any other type of war, we are ready to fight till the end." So China has historically maintained a very careful and diplomatic tone when commenting on world affairs. So in your opinion, does this rhetoric signal a different strategy from China? And what implications does Trump's tariffs and trade war against China have for China and the rest of the world?
Well, I think firstly, China's responding in kind in a way to the aggressive tone from Washington. And I think often Western media misinterpret China to sort of suit their own narratives about it. And one part of that narrative is the idea that China was a nasty communist aggressive state under Chairman Mao and became a nice, friendly capitalist state under Deng Xiaoping and is now a nasty aggressive communist state again. But actually, an understanding of Chinese history would show that that was much more of a steady evolution of Chinese politics than any kind of swing between these positions. And one example of that, when Xi Jinping said, I think a year or two ago, that China would take a central place in world affairs, standing tall and strong in the East. There were articles across the British press saying he had reversed Deng Xiaoping's policy, which was summed up in the phrase, hide our strength and bide our time. But the obvious riposte to that is that the phrase bide our time has an inbuilt time limit. Deng Xiaoping was saying we need to build up our strength and we need to hide it in that sense, but we are going to be a major international power. And I think China is now that major international power. And what they're saying to Donald Trump is you can't push us around. Now, he can certainly push a lot of countries around. We know that Panama has already essentially, it's withdrawn from the Belt and Road Initiative with China under essentially US bullying, and it's agreed to the effectively forced sale of two major harbour facilities in the Panama Canal from a Hong Kong-based company to the US firm BlackRock, again, because of Trump's kind of unsubstantiated claims that the canal could be controlled by China in some way. So he's definitely pushing around other countries, and he's slapped tariffs on British steel, and Britain has not dared to respond. But what China is saying is we're not in that category. If you attack us with tariffs and so on, we will take reciprocal measures. And if you go further than that, we are prepared for it. I don't think it's an aggressive statement from the Chinese. I don't think they're saying that they would want to go to war with the United States, but what they're saying is don't imagine that it will be a pushover if you try to attack us. We do have this slightly unstable dynamic in international power at the moment. You've got the United States, which is by far the biggest military power in the world. I think military spending more than 10 times, well, no, larger than the next 10 countries put together. Whereas China is by far the biggest manufacturing power in the world, and it's almost an equivalent imbalance. The Chinese manufacturing economy is larger than that of the next 9 countries put together. And China is also the biggest distributor of real goods in the world. It has the largest shipping fleet. So Trump is determined to try to change that. He's determined to try and derail Chinese economic development. That's not a completely new thing from Trump. We've seen the Biden administration was also attempting to do that with its tariffs on China and its various attacks on China, justified by all sorts of accusations against the Chinese and human rights abuses in Xinjiang. I mean, we have to slap controls on the export of solar panels and so on. That was all about trying to attack China's leading role in environmental and renewable technology. China has never tried to choke off US trade. It's never tried to stymie US economic development. So I don't think we should see it as a kind of rivalry where there are two powers kind of going up against each other. What we are seeing is a United States that has been dominant for a very long time, showing it's very unwilling to be out-competed by China in peaceful competition. And the positive and the negative there is that it's almost impossible to see how the United States could outcompete China in a fair competition economically, partly simply because of China's enormous population size. China keeps getting richer. It will simply get bigger than the United States economically because of that. But also, as we've seen from the whole economic development over the last 20 years, China's planned economy has achieved miracles in terms of lifting hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, building this enormous high-speed rail network, taking the lead in all these new technologies from healthcare to nuclear fusion to all these kind of renewable energy fields. China's kind of shooting ahead and it doesn't need to fight to win, but the United States might feel that it does need to fight in order to stop China from winning. And that's the really dangerous thing. I think a lot of the destabilization we saw around Hong Kong, Xinjiang was linked to that, and Xinjiang particularly because of the importance of the mineral resources of Xinjiang, the rare earths and so on. It was always in the interest of the United States to see if it could create trouble for China in that region. Hong Kong, a huge center of Asian trade and so on. So there was obviously a logic there. But I think the issue of Taiwan is probably the most explosive now. And again, this is one which is completely misrepresented most of the time in Western media. In fact, Taiwan is recognized as Chinese territory by almost all governments in the world, including the British government, including the US government. And China has not been attempting to change the status quo in Taiwan by force. It's always said that it's in favor of a proper reunification, that it wants that to happen peacefully, that it would happen by a gradual assimilation, trade, and contacts across the Taiwan Strait. A strategy which was working until a few years ago. China and Taiwan became each other's biggest trading partners, huge travel between the two. There were businesses with operations in Taiwan and on the mainland and so on. And it's the US and Taiwanese separatist governments which have tried to crack down on that in recent years, building up these kind of national security scares in order to shut down businesses that have their bases in the mainland, complaining ironically about a brain drain to China, which is a really interesting complaint from the Taiwanese in a way, because if you were to read Western media, you get China depicted as this authoritarian, repressive state, and Taiwan as this beacon of freedom. But the Taiwanese are saying all of our young graduates are moving to the mainland, and that's a problem for our economy. Why would they be doing that if China was as bad as people are suggesting? So what we're seeing is an attempt to create a kind of situation that China would find intolerable, like a declaration of independence from Taiwan or something along those lines, as a trigger for conflict. And we saw the US State Department, it changed the wording on one of its websites and then, of course, said, oh, it's nothing to worry about, just a routine update. But it removed a reference to saying the United States will not support Taiwanese independence. And that, again, is potentially a sign that the US is preparing some kind of provocation around Taiwan. If that happens, we all need to be really clear that this has been a situation artificially created by the US to try and provoke a war with China. It's certainly not about the welfare of Taiwan. And Britain's role in the Far East, a completely unnecessary posturing position, tagging along with the United States military in the Far East, it risks us being dragged into a conflict that is provoked there artificially. And that would be a disastrous conflict for the world, but a disastrous conflict for Britain to be involved in as well.
It does seem that Britain is participating in this aggressive new Cold War against China. Britain's Foreign Secretary David Lammy has recently toured the Philippines and has made headlines for stirring up division in the South China Sea. Can you expand a little bit on, like you're saying, it's really good if the UK, if we would just not be involved in this, but it seems like we're going gung-ho ahead. I mean, if I looked up UK and China yesterday, and it was all about when China invades Taiwan, we're going to be in trouble. Basically, that's what they're going for. Can you sort of tease out how invested Britain is in this rhetoric? And is there any sort of indication that we might break ties in any way from the US?
I think the British government is, to an extent, trying to have its cake and eat it on this question. It has been very aggressive in the Far East. It has signed up to the AUKUS Pact. It has sent the warships over there. We talked earlier about this idea that the British are trying to prove to the United States that they're a valuable military partner, and therefore they are willing to spend quite a lot of money on demonstrating that we are an adjunct to US imperialism in the Far East. There's an idea in Britain that goes a long way back that we're a global power, not a European power. Disraeli in the 19th century actually said we're not a European but an Asian power. In the 19th century, of course, that made a certain degree of sense with the British Empire ruling India and Hong Kong and so on. It doesn't make a huge amount of sense now, but it's also not entirely untrue. If you look at the way that the British Empire was dismantled, the United States made sure to maintain these little outposts, as we see in the Indian Ocean with the Diego Garcia, the Chagos Islands. That's been a fairly major row in Britain recently, the displacement of the local inhabitants to make way for an American military base on a British overseas territory. These little outposts of the former empires are used as important staging posts for the projection of US military power worldwide. And that's not just true of Diego Garcia. If you look at the Solomon Islands and the Pacific, they're involved mainly via an Australian security pact in the encirclement of China. In the Solomon Islands, who's the head of state in the Solomon Islands? It's King Charles III. Although there's no British Empire anymore, there is an artificially maintained kind of network of islands and bases and links which allow Britain to continue to be very useful to the United States internationally, way beyond Europe. That's one reason why these kind of outposts, they're not the kind of harmless relics that people sometimes think. We need full decolonization. Countries that still have Charles as their king, including Britain, need to stop having Charles as their king. But we do need to essentially be aware of that kind of international network of bases, which puts Britain in Asia as well. But at the same time, the British government, Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor, she went on a recent visit to China and was asking for Chinese investment. There's a sort of domestic political row over the expansion of the Chinese embassy, which so far the Labour government is in favour of, and it's being kind of attacked in the right-wing media for giving in to the Chinese on the expansion of the embassy. China is the biggest single source of overseas students at universities in Britain. And Britain has actually attacked those students in many ways. It's massively increased the number of visas that are refused to researchers and scientists from China on so-called security grounds, which are really kind of bogus most of the time. They're like, oh, you have a link to the Chinese state. Well, if you've got an economy which is significantly state-owned like the Chinese, you can turn to any scientist and say you've got links to the Chinese state. And that's being used. It's really shooting us in the foot in terms of international scientific cooperation and so on. So I think there are figures in the Labour Party who would like all this to continue because there's an obvious economic benefit to it. But at the same time, their pull towards the United States is much stronger. And we saw under the previous government, when the United States kind of told us, you have to break your ties with Huawei, you have to rip up the contract with Huawei to deliver 5G networks across Britain. The British government didn't want to do that initially, but it did so because the US told it to. And actually, there was an embarrassing letter which Huawei later leaked in which they said, if the US changes its mind, we would like to do business with you again. So that's the difficult situation that we're in. I think we need to put pressure on the British government to say this investment is important. Climate change is an important issue. China's got the technology. China's the place with the expertise on this. All of these universities in Britain, which have got their own financial crises, if you start shutting out Chinese students, even if you don't ban them from coming here, Chinese people are not going to want to study in a country which is demonizing China to that extent, and which is becoming more hostile across the board to foreigners. So actually, we need to make the case for Chinese investment and partnership and say, there's no benefit to Britain in tying ourselves to essentially a losing fight to maintain American military supremacy. There's nothing in that for the British people.